Well, welcome and hi again, Jesse.
Hi, Paul. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to see you again and welcome to 2022. It's January. We took a little hiatus, but we're ready to go for episode 2 of your Resilience Zone.
Let's
Are you
do
ready?
it.
Okay. So the first episode, as you all remember, we went over some toxic stress and adverse childhood experiences. We talked about your resilience zone being sort of, I don't know, Jesse, what do you think, like a band of coping that people have?
Yeah, and that band can stretch and it can shrink. And we're going to start to look at, what skills we can all practice to really strengthen and widen that resilient zone bandwidth.
Great. And today, what we've devoted that topic to is biology. And the
Mhm.
biology has a lot to do with its connection to stress, and we'll look at that in the next few minutes.
Yep, I love this topic because for a couple of reasons, but one being that biology is something we all have in common. So it's really something that we can all talk about. And as far as biology and the skills that we're going to be sharing today and throughout the next episodes, it's a way that we can just kind of work within our own self to help us with our stress response. And so, something I like to mention right up front is really how our body responds to stress is fairly similar amongst all of us. I don't know about you, Paul, but do you ever get like tension in your neck or shoulders, or maybe your stomach hurts if you're stressed out about something?
Sure, stuck in traffic, having a bad day, didn't sleep well, all those things.
Exactly. And that's pretty common all around the world. And, now we don't have to feel isolated in those feelings, right? Another thing is in our culture and many cultures is that sometimes when we're having those types of reactions, we assume that we are weak, or we assume someone else is weak and they can't handle something. And this is really meant to shift that perspective. It's not because we're weak and can't handle something. It's really how our body is designed to respond in times of stress or trauma. So, we're going to learn a little bit more about those responses today and how we can tap into that to help ourselves feel a bit more calm and in control.
I was thinking, Jesse, it's a little bit like a chicken and egg problem, isn't it? Sometimes when I'm stressed, my body feels it first. I'm tight in my muscles, my stomach
Mhm.
hurts, I twitch. And sometimes I'm thinking of something that is bothering me. And then afterwards, I start to feel the stress.
Yeah, I have experienced both sides of that too. And the neat thing is we're going to share a skill today called tracking that will really help everybody get a little bit more in tune to picking up on those signals. Because the quicker we can pick up on those signals that our body is telling us, I think the more easily we can get to a place where we feel a little bit better.
That's great. Let's take a big picture view of it. You want
Yeah,
to
so let's
start on
start
the
with the
brain?
brain.
Okay.
Like, where else would we start, right? The most complex organ in the body, right?
Head to the top.
So the brain, as we all know, is extremely complex, right? But we're going to boil it down to three main areas that are really at play when there is a stress response in particular. I like to go through this using my hand as well, so you can follow along if you're watching. So there's three main parts we'll talk about. So the first part is the survival brain, and I'm pointing at my wrist right now. So think about your wrist as the survival part of our brain. It's right back here at the brain stem. It's the first part of the brain that develops. It's sometimes called the reptilian brain. And the interesting part about this survival part of our brain is that is where we process those survival responses. You may have heard of fight or flight. There's also freeze. Those responses are things that we don't think about or decide. They happen automatically. And that's like other systems in our body that we don't have to consciously think about, such as digestion. I don't have to think too hard about my body digesting lunch. It just does that. And so that survival part of our brain is really important to carry out a lot of basic functions and also keeps us alive if we're experiencing something dangerous.
Sometimes
But it doesn't work alone. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, it seems like we're not even needing like thinking. As a teenager, I got hit by a car and my body automatically curled up and it
Mhm.
rolled, and I wasn't thinking, oh, it's time to roll.
Exactly.
My body just did it.
Exactly. I sometimes think about the Marvel movie Iron Man, how he has this awesome like drop down menu and he gets to pick and choose what happens and how he responds. We're not built like that. Our survival brain is going to do what it does automatically, and it's going to automatically respond with the action that's going to most likely increase our survival in that moment.
That's
So
a
that's
good
our
thing.
wrist. So let's think about the limbic area. So if you're following along, that thumb would fold in. So that's in the center of our brain. That's where we process emotions. And sometimes highly emotional situations can also be correlated with risk. And so that's where we also assess risk level. And there's a little piece of this limbic area called the amygdala, and it's so important. It is kind of like the smoke detector or fire alarm in our brain. It's always on and always scanning. Sometimes it goes off even when there's not a fire. I don't know about you, but my kitchen smoke detector will go off if I'm burning dinner and there's no threat, but there might be. And so it's important, right? Because we want it on and scanning. And in some cases, it could be a life or death situation or something very dangerous. And so it's important for it to be aware of potential risks. And so that amygdala is an important piece of that appraisal system. So then with my forefingers, I'm going to fold that over my thumb. That's the cortex. It's the front part of our brain. It's the last part of our brain to develop. And actually, Paul, you may know this better than me, but I think it's in our late teen years, maybe even early 20s, where that cortex is fully developed.
They've been pushing that back actually, so that
Okay.
technically adulthood may not happen for some until 25 or so. It's a longer and longer period of until the brain is really like matured in its higher level thinking processes. Now that's really interesting point, Jesse, because some of the limbic area that you talked about, the emotional functioning, there's so many things happening during adolescence, and then
Mhm.
they may be making decisions based on their emotional processing, and those decisions are not always in conjunction with what might be best for the higher level thinking.
Yeah, exactly. And it really speaks to how that cortex is not physiologically fully developed yet. There's, you know, not much we can do about that, but that's just the way our biology is working. And so how these pieces kind of communicate with each other, if our amygdala is scanning for threat and it signals danger, it's going to sound an alarm. That's going to make that cortex go offline. So we're not going to be really thinking too clearly in those moments. And it's going to send the signal to our survival brain that we need something, we need to do something to survive. And your example earlier was just a great example. Your amygdala said, this is dangerous, there's risk. You didn't have to think about what your body needed to do in that moment. It essentially just curled up, and you were able to clearly come out on the other side of that. So that's just a really interesting way our brain works in that situation.
I work with a lot of teachers and school principals. And one thing is, when you have a classroom of kids who are at high risk, who have gone through all these different experiences outside of school, sometimes they are in this survival mode. And it's really
Yes.
hard to then calm down and focus. I work with youth who have been bullied, and they're always on high alert, thinking about when it might happen again. And when our bodies are on high alert, it's really hard to get into that cortex of higher level thinking and focus.
Yep, I'm so glad you mentioned that. And it makes me think about our resilient zone that we talked about in episode 1. If our cortex is offline, if we're in survival mode, our resilient zone is very, very narrow. And so we don't have a lot of bandwidth to deal with other life stressors that come our way. So it's not just because we're choosing to not pay attention or to act out, but we really physically just don't have the capability to do so in those moments.
Some of my clinical colleagues in mental health sometimes call this upstairs and downstairs brain. The
Yeah.
downstairs brain, like your uh, underground, it's kind of that reptilian, like you said. And when youth are in that area, it's really hard to slow things down and try and move them upstairs. Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Absolutely.
Great.
So the brain, of course, is just one piece to this biology that we'll look at today. So let's see what we've got next.
Well,
Neuroplasticity. Yeah. So a little bit more about our brain. There's a saying, you can't teach old dogs new tricks, right? But that's a myth. We know that now. And neuroplasticity is just a fancy way of saying we can learn new tricks. And so think about any time you've had to learn a new skill or a hobby, it takes practice, but over time, you get better and it gets easier to do that hobby or that skill. And so our brain is very similar. We can try new things, we can learn new skills that'll help calm that amygdala down. And the more we practice, the easier that will be next time we face a challenge.
exactly. I think that's, yeah, I love how this half of the brain in the picture is so colorful, because sometimes putting ourselves in new situations, a new challenge that you're excited about, all of that makes these new connections in the brain, and then we're all healthier and happier.
Absolutely.
So let's see, not all stress is equal, is it, Jesse?
No, we all experience stress differently, and there's different kinds of stress in our lives. So I like to show this because it just puts things into perspective. And again, we're not alone when we experience stress. There's really a spectrum. You've got your positive stress, which are the positive events in your life, but come along with quite a bit of work and stress and thought involved. Sometimes a wedding or a graduation, for example, could be instances of positive stress in our lives. And then there's tolerable stresses, the hard things that we go through, and oftentimes we are able to cope and get through those. And we have protective factors in our life that help us move through that tolerable stress. And then the far right of this says toxic stress. And I think that that term can get tossed around, but it really does reference this extreme or extended activation of that body stress response that we've been talking about. And there's no buffering presence. There aren't things around us that'll help move us through it. It kind of feels like we're stuck there. And so that's what we're referring to as toxic stress, which could be a harmful place to stay. And so we're learning ways that we can move through that. And we're learning with research now what protective factors we can have in place for children and adults to limit the exposure to toxic stress.
I think that's a really important point, because we can build in some of those protective factors and have them be positive ways to cope. And it also, with the stress, we all have stress most of the or almost all the time, but what
Mhm.
kind of stress and for how long? And
Mhm.
that constant, like, high level of stress, even if it's, something that you're devoted to, can really wear down some of the circuits in our body, if you will.
Sure. Mhm. So the other big piece of our biology we'll talk about rather quickly is the nervous system. That's something else we all have in common. And our nervous systems all respond pretty similarly to stress and to trauma or adversity. And again, these aren't responses that we really think about. It just happens automatically in our body. And when we look at these two features of the nervous system, I think about a car. I think about how every car, hopefully, right, has a gas pedal and a brake pedal. We need both. So, looking at the nervous system, that sympathetic nervous system is like our gas pedal. It's going to prepare us to go, it's going to prepare us for action in times of stress. And you'll notice that sometimes you may start to breathe faster, your breath becomes more shallow, or your heart rate increases, all of these physiological responses. And then we've got the brake pedal. We have the parasympathetic nervous system, and that's going to help us calm back down. It's where we take that big deep breath. It's sometimes called rest and digest, and we need both. If they're kind of always working in tandem. However, if we're foot on the gas all day, if that sympathetic nervous system is constantly on because of what we are experiencing or what people around us are experiencing, that can start to cause some wear and tear on our bodies.
Absolutely. It's good to know when we need to put the brakes on. And sometimes our body has this response cycle that things are an emergency. You might have a traumatic event like getting hit by a car, like I mentioned earlier. The body's alarm system goes off, and then stress hormones kind of can flood the system. We haven't talked that much about those, but they're the body's regulation of those two sympathetic and parasympathetic system that Jesse just talked about. Body floods with cortisol or adrenaline, giving us extra, energy for our muscles. And if you're on that emergency for so long, it takes a toll, like you just mentioned, and we have to be able to find ways to downshift.
Absolutely.
Okay. So this is an example I wanted to bring in for our audience, Jesse. This is a poster that an eighth grader drew in a bullying prevention contest that we had. And the message on the poster is bullying hurts. And it was really interesting because right after that, and a few months later, there was an academic article that showed that social pain is processed in the same circuits of the brain as physical pain. So this black eye that the character in the middle has is just as painful as being the joking bully in the background that's humiliating him. Both of those things are encoded in a very emotional way, I think, in our downstairs brain, in that limbic system, the emotional system. And that's why something like being humiliated by a bully is so difficult for a lot of youth to manage.
Mhm. I think it's so telling. I'm just really like zoning in on the red shape, behind that person's head, and how often when we experience something hurtful or stressful, we feel a lot of tension in our head. And sometimes people will say, I see red if they're really mad. And so I think that's such a good visual image drawn by this child and so accurate.
Yeah, and that is he's walking around with that sort of
Hmm.
red halo of pain,
Yeah.
and depending on how long that goes, how many times he's bullied, it can be really difficult to adjust to because it's a form of toxic stress.
Hmm.
So that youth who has been bullied is in this fight, fight, or flee or freeze, and has this flood of cortisol, and his body is trying to regulate it to kind of downshift, but that's harder and harder depending on how difficult the experience is. Let me give you another example. This is another social example of bullying, is that's my mental health focus with lots of kids. And so here you see the victim on the ground asking for his backpack back, and you can see how social this is. It's happening in a classroom with all of his classmates hearing. Here's the teacher who doesn't really want to deal with this type of thing. It happens so often. And this is really, you can imagine his biology all a haywire.
Hmm.
And he can't fight. Look at how big the bully is. He's, I guess, probably freezing, Jesse, probably just in
Yeah.
complete fear. And the fact that all of his classmates are laughing and cheering it on is a social humiliation that's really difficult to adjust to.
I can't. Yeah, it's It's hard to think about this because I know this happens a lot, you know,
It
and just
does.
think, yeah.
I mean, in middle school, almost 50% of kids report across the United States report being bullied.
Mm,
So some of that, to some it's traumatic, others cope very well and are quite resilient. So right in line with our model. But I do want to show there's a lot of research around bullying, and it's a good example of how there's consequences for both our psychological, social, and biological health. So we see reduced academic performance because kids can't settle down and focus. Their attention is going to when it might happen again. There's more depression, anxiety, shame, and humiliation. There's more suicidal behavior. Sometimes this can lead to eating disorders in youth. It can lead to violence and intimacy problems, even as adults. And it's a long road of trying to adjust after a profoundly negative experience. This is one of the ACEs that we talked about in episode 1. So it can take 7 years for the body and the use mind to kind of be able to settle and adjust. And by that time, they're in a new developmental stage. They've
mhm.
moved from middle school into the college years after 7 years if they're going.
Yeah, I think it's so important to really reconnect that mind and body, right? I mean, we have a tendency to separate
Exactly.
that, but when we experience emotions or highly emotionally charged events, that really does impact our bodies.
Absolutely. So here's some examples. Why don't you, you're in the healthcare field, so can you connect to this a little bit for us?
Yeah. So, as we've been alluding to, and we saw in episode 1, when we looked at the adverse childhood experiences study, we know that data really does make that connection for us. If we experience violence or adversity in our childhood, it puts us at an increased risk for some health problems down the road. And so this looks at our body and just starts to weave this web of possible implications that we could see down the road for our health. And this stands for consequences of lifetime exposure to violence and abuse. And so this is like that toxic stress that we were talking about, that prolonged stress that we there are no supports in place for, and that nervous system is always on. As you can see, it really impacts virtually every system in our body.
It sure does in really profound ways and over time from something that might happen in childhood can have implications long term into
Yeah,
adulthood.
absolutely. I think it's easy to think about how, oh, it happened when I was a kid, it won't matter later, but it really does, and we're seeing that now.
Yeah. Luckily, I think there's some skills that we can all use that are accessible and free and helpful for most people. So why don't you
Yeah,
take us into the other side of things?
happy to. And so adversity is not destiny. That's something I like to remind people when we talk about stress and trauma. We always have the ability to bounce back, to get that resilient zone nice and wide. And one way we can do that is practicing skills from what's called the community resiliency model. And the words that you see here in these different bubbles, those are our different skills. And we call it CRIM for short. So these are our CRIM skills. And so we're going to actually introduce one today. It's called tracking. And this skill is really central to all the other skills. And so we'll use it and reference it going forward also. So it's important to cover first, but it's also really closely tied to our biology. So let's start there with tracking. Tracking is the first skill. It's really all about paying attention to our nervous system. That slide we looked at earlier with the gas pedal and the brake pedal, we really want to become more practiced at picking up on those physical cues that we are beginning to feel stressed. And even more importantly, when we start to feel back to being calm. When we pay attention to that, it really helps expand that sensation in our body. So earlier we talked about how we can sense in and notice if we have sore muscles or an upset stomach, for example, if we're feeling upset or worried. And on the other side of that coin, we can pay attention to the relaxed muscles and the deep breath that we might take when we feel a bit better and more calm and in control. A lot of people say that this is very similar to something called mindfulness, which is really just kind of being an active participant in the thoughts and feelings that you're experiencing. And so you can sort of, it's similar in that way. And with tracking, we're really kind of honing in on our biology. What's our body telling us in that moment?
That's a good point. I think mindfulness for the mental health field has kind of brought the idea that sensations and feelings and thoughts even as well, they're in our bodies and we can observe them,
Mhm.
and we can, if we observe them and don't want to act, we can let them go. They
Mhm.
come and they go, and that's, I think, a part of this tracking idea. You can be aware of your stomach and my anxiety going through my brain, but you don't have to necessarily let it move you to you know, action.
That's exactly right.
So let's see.
All
Oh.
right. So we call this our superhero slide because these figures remind us of superheroes. And basically, what happened is a group of people colored in where they felt increased sensations in their body for different emotions. And so I like this because it kind of looks at some common emotions that we are familiar with and maybe have experienced and where we feel greater sensations. And so the first one we see is anger. We see a lot of sensation in the chest and the head. And as I mentioned earlier, that's really coinciding with that image that that kid drew, right? And yeah, the sayings that we have now, like I see red or I feel hot-headed if we feel mad about something. But look at pride, for instance. I think of pride as being proud of something either I did or someone else did, and we carry still a lot of increased sensation in the upper body. But I would say that that might feel differently, right? So part of tracking is also asking, is that sensation unpleasant, pleasant, or neutral? And then we have a choice. If it's unpleasant, we can work on something else to get you to a place where you're feeling a little bit better.
I like to point out with this, it's interesting how strong the emotions are in some of the positive ones, and happiness and pride. I mean, those we can track as well and really immerse ourselves in some of these positive feelings.
Definitely. And that's what's great about tracking. It gives us choice of what we pay attention to.
All
Let's
right.
go to the next slide. Yeah. And so just like it feels good to be able to have that choice and pay attention to what feels good for us in that moment, what we pay attention to expands. And so the flower graphics on here are really intentional. If you like to garden, think about a garden. Of course, there's going to be some weeds that we have to take care of. But if we didn't pay attention, those weeds might overpower. If we pay attention to the flowers and the plants and we water them and we take care of them, hopefully that's what grows more in the garden. So we can really choose what we pay attention to and that will expand. So that's our first skill of tracking. Like I said, we'll reference that in the next few episodes because we do use it with each and every skill. But it's really the first one that teaches us how to start reading our own biology. And this is some really great research that was done on children and adolescents in school. And these children and adolescents did experience adverse childhood experiences. However, even though they had ACEs, they showed resilience if they were able to stay calm and in control when faced with a challenge. And it actually helped decrease the negative impacts that ACEs had in their life. So that goes back to me saying adversity isn't destiny. There's hope, and with skills, not only with CRIM, but there's so many other wellness practices that we can incorporate. It'll help us stay calm in when we're faced with a challenge. Nobody's perfect, right? But it gives us some skills that we can lean on, and it's going to help reduce the negative impact that stress has in our life and in our biology.
Being aware, I think, is a major step, and then you can put into place a lot of these different techniques like mindfulness, again, being calm. Sometimes with my clients, I use imagery. There's a lot of different ways to cope in healthy and positive ways. But I think that for today, we've gone over quite a bit, Jesse. So I
Mhm.
look forward to our next meetings and different episodes. And shall we leave it there?
I think that's a good place to stop.
All right. Well, thanks for spending this time together.
Thank you.
Bye.